share my screen first of all. So one of the things I wanted to remind you about is the fact that from last week, there was an assignment that I'd given you called exercise number 1. So remember that these small exercises, there'll be one of these every week, and these build over the time, sort of like building like a resource of techniques that you can use on your creative projects as well. So this ties into project 1, but I'm simply having you copy stuff that's already done, right? So if you haven't done that one yet, this is the template that you need to download to work over the top of to make sure you get that done. I think quite a lot of people have already done this, but if you haven't done it, you need to get that done actually by the end of today. So you have until 11:59 tonight to get this exercise done. It shouldn't really take too long, I don't think. And then there is a set of videos here that you need for this. So on this, if I go into here for a second so you can take a look at it. So on this sheet, there are 6 little exercises you have to do. One of them is to do with rotating an object around a center point. One of them is this figure, one of them is this cube, and so on. And there are videos for all of those 6 elements that you have to include on that sheet. So if you haven't done it, that's a priority, because you need to have this turned in on time to get the 3 points, okay? So that's the first thing. The other thing is that at this point in the course, you should have the thumbnails done for the first project. So remember that there's the exercises, which are these small step-by-step exercises that we do, and I give you videos, tutorials that explain it. But then there's the major projects, which are creative. So the first major project is project 1, and it's the symbols project. It's the one where you're going to create 15 symbols and set them up 5 across and 3 down on a page. And for this, you need to do 4 thumbnail sketches for each one of those symbols. So ultimately, you'll have 60 thumbnail sketches, right? So I know that many of you have already done that, but if you haven't done it, make sure you get caught up with those. Those should be submitted to project 1. So if you went to assignments, from a student view, actually, you don't see all this stuff right now because I haven't posted it, but you'll see symbols and exercise 1. Project 1, sorry, and exercise 1, you're going to submit this thumbnail sketches to project 1 symbols. Okay, so you'll click in here and then you'll submit it. This part of the exercise, by the way, is not so crucial just because I don't actually grade any of that first project until after we've met individually on week 4. So on week 3, we're going to do a critique. Then you have a few more days from the Wednesday class to the following Monday class to go back and make changes to it and resubmit it for grading. And then I'll meet with you individually on Zoom to go over the grade for that project, all right? So if you don't submit the thumbnails right now, it isn't that crucial, but just in terms of where you should be at, I would suggest that you should have the thumbnails done. If you haven't, get a move on getting those done and then start working on them in Illustrator, okay? All right.
So with each step of the project, we just keep resubmitting to project.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, okay, thank you.
So when you submit the thumbnails for that project, I can download them and look at them. So if we need to discuss your thumbnails, like if we had an individual meeting or something, I can discuss them with you.
Oh, okay.
Okay, we're going to do I'm going to do a couple of review exercises, but before I get to that, let me just go over a couple of review questions. Starting this week, there's going to be a couple of tests that we do, just sort of like multiple choice tests. So some of these review questions is where I pull those questions from. So the first one is, what is meant by raster effect settings? Does anybody remember what that means? Raster effect settings in Illustrator. The way you find it is here, view, and then you go under here and you'll see raster effect settings. Where do I see that? Oh, because I'm in InDesign, that's why. That was a bit confusing. Okay, so we go to view, and then under here, we still see, I still don't see it. Where is it? Oh, I'm sorry, it's under effects. So document raster effect settings right here. You'll also see it mentioned when you go to file new and you create a new file. You go into more settings. Under here, you have raster effect. In this particular case, it's 300 ppi. So what is raster effect settings? What is that about? Anybody have any clues? Any ideas? So basically, it's to do with the way that Illustrator deals with things which require pixels. Illustrator, remember, is resolution independent. We don't have to worry about resolution, generally speaking, because of the nature of the program, because it's a vector-based program. There are no pixels. Everything's made out of anchor points and paths, which enables it to be scalable and allows us to take something which is very small and make it much bigger and without losing any quality. Whereas if you're in a bitmap program like Photoshop, when you scale it, those pixels become apparent and then it becomes a bit of a problem. So with the raster effect settings, things which require pixels in Photoshop, in Illustrator. So something like this, effects, stylize, drop shadow, for instance. Let me put a solid fill on this so we can see it a little bit better. So on this object, I've applied this drop shadow. And because this file is set up at 300 ppi for the document raster effect settings, this looks very, very smooth. But if I go under effects, document raster effect settings, and then change that to 72 pixels per inch and press OK, you'll then start to see the pixels become more apparent. So generally speaking, in Illustrator, we don't have to worry about resolution, but that is the one caveat to that, is that there are these odd effects where they use pixels. Now, this is actually still scalable. If I scale this object, it's going to add additional pixels. So it's not going to lose resolution. It's not going to go from 72 ppi now to, say, 30 ppi, like it would in Photoshop. But it's still something we have to be aware of. And when you create a new file, it creates that raster effect settings based off what type of file you're making. In simple terms, anything you create which is print is 300 in the document raster effect settings. And any of the other ones, which are screen-based, mobile, web, film and print and so on, they'll be set to 72 ppi. So remember that these in a test would be a multiple choice question, but you need to understand basically what the idea of that is. So it's used for effects which require resolution. Number 6, is Illustrator resolution independent? I just mentioned this. So is Illustrator resolution independent? Yeah, Illustrator is resolution independent. Photoshop would be resolution dependent. So when you make something in Photoshop, you have to really think about, am I doing this for screen? Am I doing it for print? How big is it going to be? Because I need to set the resolution when I create the file. In Illustrator, that's not really necessary. The slight exception, of course, is that document raster effect settings. But pretty much everything you do in Illustrator will be resolution independent. And the program is considered to be resolution independent. What is the keyboard shortcut for transform again? So we had done this, for instance, when we were doing the flower, right at the very first week, when we were converting stuff. When we were rotating the petal. What is that? Yeah, I don't have it open actually, but if you remember, we'd created something and rotated it around the center point.
Isn't it like Option D or something like that?
You're really close, actually. Command D. So Command D. Or Control D on a PC, actually, yeah. Very good. So and you can do this for anything where you want to repeat what you did last. I find this a really useful keyboard shortcut. So we had used it once in this flower demonstration where we had created the shape by pulling the bottom point down, if you remember. And then with the convert anchor point tool, I'd gone in and got rid of the handles at the bottom. And then we'd select that shape. And then with the rotate tool, we had option click just underneath the shape. So we define that it's going to rotate from that new point rather than in the center of the object. We set a numerical value, 30 degrees, and then hit copy. Now this is where Command D comes in. So we've just rotated it through 30 degrees from this point and duplicated it all in one step. So now if we do Command D, it's going to do the same thing. It's rotating it from that same point through the same number of degrees, and it's duplicating it each time. But you can also use it for other purposes. Like I'll give you another example. I'm going to group these and scale it a lot, put it out of the way. So like, let's say you have an object and you want to scale it to fit into a particular area, but you're not quite sure how much you need to scale it by. If I double click double click on the scale tool, I want to make sure that scale, stroke, and effects is on so that the stroke scales along with the object. And then I can set it to say 98%, then press OK. Then if I just do Command D, I can scale it another 98% until it's the size that I need it to be at. If I go a bit too far, I can do Command Z and come back up again. So it's kind of useful for things like that. It's also useful, like if you wanted to create like a whole collection of objects which are evenly spaced. So for instance, let's say you wanted to make a whole bunch of buildings on a skyscraper, sorry, windows on a skyscraper. I could draw one. I could even add detail to it, but I won't bother with that for right now. But I could add reflections and stuff. And then I could duplicate that window across by dragging Shift to keep it straight, Option to duplicate it, and then do Command D. So we've now got a bunch of those rectangles. And if I select that whole row, I can drag it down this way, hold Shift Option, and then do Command D this way around. So that keyboard shortcut is really useful if you want to kind of make multiple versions of something which are evenly spaced in that kind of way. It's very useful for that type of stuff. What key do you use to subtract when you're using the Shape Builder tool? So the Shape Builder tool is a little bit like Pathfinder. It allows you to add shapes together, subtract shapes from each other. We'll use it in this exercise, which I'm going to demonstrate in today's class. But for instance, let's say we have two overlapping ellipses. And I want to use one to cut away from another one. So I'm going to set these up where it's a stroke so that you can see the way these two shapes interact a little bit. We have one over the top of the other, obviously, because in Illustrator, the last shape you draw is always on the top. No. And every single shape occupies its own level. So this one's slightly higher than this one. If I select both of them, let's say I only want this middle section right here. In Pathfinder, move this over. In Pathfinder, I could do this one right here, which is intersect. When I do intersect, that's the third one along of these shape modes. And what I'll end up with is, I'll end up with where those two shapes overlapped. So this is an interesting way to create that shape. We could create that shape another way by drawing an ellipse. And then with the anchor point tool, click on each end, and then it will remove the curves. And we'll end up with a very similar shape to if we had two overlapping ellipses. But we could also do a similar thing by using the Shape Builder tool. So if I have these two overlapping shapes, if I wanted to join them together and make them into one shape, I could simply drag across those three areas where they overlap. So this one, and this one. I can just drag right across, and then they become one. But if I wanted to subtract from them, I need to hold down a particular key. Does anybody remember what that key is?
Option.
Option, very good, or Alt on a PC. So if I click now holding Alt or Option, I can remove those parts around the outside, or if I wanted to, I could remove this part, obviously, whatever you're trying to cut. But this is an interesting idea, I think, particularly for this kind of project where you're creating symbols or simple graphic shapes, is to start with basic shapes like circles and then overlap them and subtract from them by using either Pathfinder or ShapeBuilder. What's the difference between this selection tool and the group selection tool? So you remember in Illustrator that we have a variety of different selection tools, actually. You've got the selection tool, you have the direct selection tool. You've also got hidden with the direct selection tool, this tool called the group selection tool. And then we also have the magic wand tool, and then we have the lasso tool. Quite a few options for how to select stuff. So one of the things that oftentimes confuses people is the difference between these two tools, the selection tool, which is the black arrow, and then the white arrow with the plus sign, which is called the group selection tool. So does anybody feel like they could explain what the difference is between those two in the way that they select objects? Okay, so it's really to do with the way that we group objects together, or the way that objects are grouped together as to how we select them. Just out of the way for a second. So let's say I take this example that I've got here. If I was to group all the elements that make this fish by doing Command G whilst they're selected, and then choose the selection tool, which is the black arrow, click away so that nothing is selected, and then click on any part of the fish, it will always select the entire fish. If I choose the group selection tool, however, and click away so that nothing is selected, and then click on one shape, you'll see that I can select one object which is part of that group. And if I click a second time, then I have the entire group. So this means that I could select one part of the object and change its color with the group selection tool. Whereas with the selection tool, I'm always going to end up selecting the entire group. There is a way to select one object with the selection tool. Does anybody remember how you do that? So let's say I wanted to select this fin and I didn't want to switch and I was on the selection tool. How could I select just that fin? Because remember, if I click on it, it's going to select everything.
You double click on it?
Yeah, you double click on it. Is that Linda?
Yes.
Yeah, so if we double click on it, what it does is it takes us into this special area called isolation mode. So we're now inside this group. And when we're inside the group, we can select individual objects with the selection tool and move them around. And you'll notice that other areas that are outside of that group that are on the artboard are sort of grayed out. So we can't even select them if we wanted to by mistake. We can only select things which are in that group. So then if I want to get out of here, I can click back on this arrow to take me out of that, or I could just double click on the background area. So what was the difference between the selection tool and the group selection tool? That was question number 9. The difference is that the selection tool allows you to select objects, allows you to select the entire group. And the group selection tool allows you to select objects which are part of the group. There is one other difference, which is that the selection tool, the black arrow, has a bounding box associated with it, which means that you could scale or rotate an object with the selection tool. The group selection tool doesn't give you that option. If you're on the selection tool and you don't see the bounding box, you can go to View, and it may be turned off. So you can see here it says Hide Bounding Box. Shift Command B or Shift Control B if you're on a PC would do the same thing. You can see now when I'm on the selection tool, I don't have a bounding box, but Shift Command B and now it's back again. How do you adjust the number of subdivisions in the grid when you choose to show grid from the view menu? So one of the methods I talked about for this, and it was in the context of the person symbol, was to use an underlying grid, which you can access by going to view and then go down to where it says show grid. And then if you also go to view and go to snap to grid, remember that you can draw very accurately with this process because it's easy to keep consistent, like the thickness of elements in relationship to each other and so on. So for instance, let's say I was to draw a rectangle with the rectangle tool here that goes over one square. And then let's make that a fill with no stroke. Then if I was to put another one at the bottom here and another one here, we know that these are automatically the same thickness. I can then join all of these together. And then on the corners, I could maybe round it off a little bit. And then I could put another piece inside of here. Now I know that this line, I know that those squares are 1/8 of an inch. So if I was to do a stroke here and set it so that it has a black fill, and then set the size up here to 0.125 IN, which is 1/8 of an inch, then this will be the same thickness of that. So using the grid can be really useful like that. If you want to change the number of subdivisions, so by default, the grid is set up to be 1 inch by 8 subdivisions. It could be whatever situation you wanted it to be. So it could be that each square is 100 pixels with 10 subdivisions. It could be that it's set up so that it's 1 inch with 20 subdivisions, whatever you want it to be. So one of the reasons why you might want to change the number of subdivisions is that if I had more, I could do more detailed descriptions of the design. So for instance, I'll give you an example. Let's say I was drawing letter forms because I wanted to design a font. And we'll look at this later in the semester as designing our own letter forms. I could start off with a very simple capital letter A by combining a bunch of rectangles like this. They're all exactly the same width because we're using the grid, so it's easy to work with. But let's say I wanted to do some small details. So for instance, I'm going to have this be a little bit thinner on this side, and also on this side right here, and also on this side. And then I want to add some serifs to it. Now, if I was to draw a serif in here, the serif would have to be pretty big because of the size of the grid. You can think of this now in terms of resolution. So the smallest serif that I could really draw would be something like this, which is way too big for that letter form. If I went to Illustrator, Preferences, Guides and Grid, and I change the number of subdivisions. So it wants to be something that 8 would go into. So it could be 16, could be 24, it could be 32. I'm going to make it 32. Now I can have a much finer level of detail. So I could do a serif which is this big. Let's move that up to there, actually. And then I can go back to there. So a serif on a letter form, you'll hear of the terms serif and sans serif. A serif is this little foot kind of shape at the end of a letter form, which comes from the Roman alphabet. And there's various theories about where serifs came from. But one of the most common one is that the scribes, the people who would paint the letter forms on the triumphal arches that Romans built in European cities when they invaded, they would put a line at the bottom of the letter form to indicate where the line stopped. So they would draw a line down with a brush, and then they would draw another line down with a brush. That's where the stonemason has to carve out the letter form. But at the bottom, they draw a line to finish it. And so the stonemason kind of interpreted that into the letter form. So we can use these like Lego. I can make another one. I can reflect it by going here. Press OK. And then duplicate that over to here. And then I can take both of these and put them on this side. So that's why you might want to change the nature of the grid. And I'm drawing it here in the context of a letter form, but the same could be true of symbols. So if you want to use the grid as a way to draw your symbols, it's very, very helpful in terms of creating consistency within your design, which is essential really when you're designing symbols, is you want to create something which has a sense of unity to it. That the different parts of the letter forms feel like they belong together, or the different parts of the symbols feel like they belong together. And also that each of those symbols, or in the case of letter forms, that each of the letters in the font feel like they belong together. So the last question was, how do you adjust the number of subdivisions in the grid when you choose to show grid from the view menu? Just to recap that, you go to Illustrator, Preferences. Now, if you're working on a PC, it will be under Edit Preferences. Otherwise, it's exactly the same. I'd go to Illustrator Preferences or Edit Preferences, Guides and Grid. And then you can adjust the number of subdivisions here. You can also adjust the number of grid line every. So instead of 72 points, which is 1 inch, you might want to have it be 100 pixels, for instance, depending on how you're working, in what context you're working, and so on. All right? All right, so that's enough for my review part of the class, or at least the review questions. I had wanted to go over and review some of these demos, but as we have videos for these, I'm going to leave this for right now and move on to new stuff. So the first thing I wanted to go over is this process. I'm going to design, we're going to draw a ribbon, and then I'm going to use envelope distort to modify that. So I have made a video for this, and it's on the, let me see if I put it on the site. Yeah, so it's right here. I'm not sure if this is still processing. It might still be processing at this point, but if not, you know, it's there. Okay. Okay, in this video. So there is a video for this one. So the idea of this demonstration, first of all, is to continue this idea of how you construct simple graphics. And then I'm also going to take a look at how we can use envelope to distort, to modify it. So in this case, we're modifying a ribbon shape, but it could be almost anything. Bear that in mind as we're doing. Okay, so this is what the graphic that we're going to start with, and then we're going to use envelope distort to modify it into shapes like this. To begin with, I'm going to start with the grid because it makes it easier for me to draw this. So I want to make sure that the grid is on and snap to grid is turned off. And then I'm going to draw a square that goes across 2 of these large squares, so 2 inches, and halfway through one of the squares, or 4 subdivisions. So this ends up being 2 inches by ½ inch. The size of it isn't that important, obviously. You could modify it and change it to whatever size you wanted. But I do want to know this width because the element that goes underneath it wants to be the same width. So this is 4 subdivisions. So if I start here, go down 4 subdivisions, and then I'm going to make this so that the center of it lines up with the edge of this rectangle. Then I'm going to send this to back. And I've made this a little bit longer than it needs to be. So I'm going to take the selection tool and I'm going to bring it in 1 square on this side. And let's bring it in another square on this side. And I'm going to go 1 more actually. Something like this. There we go. Okay, once I've got that done, I'm going to then choose the pen tool. And with this object at the bottom selected, I'm going to add an anchor point on the left-hand side. So you notice that when I put my cursor over this rectangle, because it's selected, when you're on the pen tool, it becomes the Add Anchor Points tool. So I can click to add a point. Then with the Direct Selection tool, I can simply nudge it with the arrows on the keyboard to nudge it in 2 squares. Then with the pen tool, I'm going to draw another shape. Starting here, I'm going to click. I'm going to go down to this area at the bottom, click again. Then I'm going to go up and click again. I'm going to make a triangle that looks like this. So you might think, well, the triangle really only needs to go to there, doesn't it, surely? Because then it would look like it's going behind it. But the trouble with that is that if I start to curve it like this, then that triangle will start to separate from the front. So we want to have a little bit of an overlap here. And then this shape can come to the front to cover it up. So object arrange, bring to front, or shift command, close bracket to bring this one to the top, all right? Then we're going to select these two shapes, that triangular shape and the one with the little cut out of it at the bottom. And we're going to reflect it over a center point. This is a useful trick in Illustrator when you're creating symbols, is taking an object and reflecting it over a specific center point. So we want it to reflect over the center of this rectangle. So if I hold Option and click here, it doesn't matter where on this line, as long as it's on that line, which is in the center of the rectangle. And you'll get a dialog box that shows up that looks like this. And we want to set it to vertical and then hit copy. So this is the same idea as rotating an object around a center point. With these transform tools like reflect, rotate, scale, there is a point of origin, right? There's an area where that shape reflects from or scales from or rotates from. In this case, it's reflecting. By default, it would reflect over itself. So if I was to simply reflect it like this, it would do that. But I want to reflect it over this center point so that it just goes like that across. Okay, I'm going to put a piece of type inside of here. I'm using option right arrow to open up the tracking. The tracking is the space between characters over a word or a sentence or a paragraph or a story. And then I'm going to select this and let's make a duplicate of it so we still have that original. So now we've got this basic graphic. We could also add some color into it. Obviously for your symbols project, you're not going to be adding color, but we're creating something which has a graphic representation of a three-dimensional surface. So if we were to darken these slightly, it would help to increase the idea that these are going behind. I'm going to select all of this, and then I'm going to go to Object, Envelope Distort, Make with Warp. You get this dialog box that shows up, and by default, it would choose Arc. That's the first of those options. There's a variety of what are called styles here. So the Object Envelope Distort, basically what it's doing is it's putting all of your graphic objects that you had selected that make up this graphic that you've drawn, in this case, the river. It's putting them all inside of an envelope, which can then be bent or shaped in some way. So here, it's bending it 42%. I could bend it 100% if I wanted to. So it would go into basically a half circle. Or the other way. I could have it bend that way also. Or a lesser extent in the other direction, and so on. You can also have it go, if you look at the distortion here underneath, I can have the horizontal side come out on one side or the other. And same with the vertical. So we can make it feel more like it's three-dimensional by having it shift in perspective like that. So I'm going to leave these actually on 0. But there's our first bend. The other thing I wanted to show you about the envelope distort is that when you create an object which is part of an envelope like this, you'll notice that I can't go in here and select individual objects. So if I want to change the color of this, for instance, I can't. Unless I go up here at the control bar, and you can see that we have a thing that says Edit Envelope, and then next to it, there's another icon that says Edit Contents. So if I choose that, now you'll see I can select that one shape and change its color. Even though I'm in the envelope. So I haven't stopped it being an envelope. I've just changed what I'm editing. I'm no longer editing the envelope. I'm editing the shapes which are in that envelope. So I'll make this one a little bit darker. So, and then obviously if you want to switch back, you can go back up here and switch it back to edit the envelope. And what it means by editing the envelope is that if we're on the direct selection tool I can go in here and take these individual anchor points that the envelope has and distort it further. So we can drag points, we can drag handles, we can adjust the shape of the object based off of this envelope by adjusting the envelope. Okay? Let's make a different version, just to give you another example of it. So if I duplicate it again, go to Object, Envelope, Distort, Make with Warp. So here's some of the other options. We have Arc Lower, which would look like this. We have Arc Upper. Remember that all of these, we can adjust them to be either more or less. We also have, so I'm not going to go through all of these, but here's Flag, for instance, and we can increase that a little bit. And then you can play around with the rest of those different styles. I'm not going to demonstrate each one. And then if we go to Object, Envelope, Distort, notice that there's a couple of other options here. So one is Make with Mesh, and one is Make with Top Object. So let's try Make with Mesh. If we do Make with Mesh, we can set up how many rows, so how many horizontal sections the grid will have, and how many columns. So let's say I just set it to 4 by 2. I can press OK here. Now you can see that there's a mesh which runs through this whole thing. Nothing's really changed visually yet in terms of the symbol. But if I take this point, I can drag that point by itself. I could select all of those points through there and nudge it down. I could take all of these and nudge that down. I could take these handles and readjust them. So maybe this one goes further up like this. Maybe this one goes further up like that. This one also. So we can sort of modify the flow of it. It's almost like you make the objects that you've drawn be a sort of more malleable liquid type gel-like stuff that you can bend and manipulate in a way that you couldn't if it was just a solid object. So that's the first demonstration. As I said, I've made a little video for this, which I've posted. This will be one of the things on exercise sheet 2. So it isn't up yet, but there'll be an exercise 2 sheet, which I'll post on Wednesday, which you need to go over, kind of like the first exercise sheet. Be a series of little exercises like this. So that's that first one. The next thing I wanted to talk about in today's class is this idea of using golden circles. So I'm calling it the Fibonacci fish because Fibonacci is a set of numbers. Fibonacci starts with 1, and then 1 again, and then 2, because you basically in Fibonacci, you add the 2 previous numbers. So 1 and 1 is 2, 2 and 1 is 3. And then 3 and 2, which are the 2 previous numbers, is 5, and then 5 and 3 is 8, and then 8 and 5 is 13, and so on, and it just continues. So you keep taking the 2 previous numbers and you add them together. So what that has developed in terms of visual language since the Renaissance is this idea that you can use that idea to create a sort of ideal beauty. This is almost like a spiritual aspect to this whole idea of the golden ratio and the Fibonacci sequence of numbers and these golden circles, which are all multiple sizes of the previous circles. So this is how we would draw it in Illustrator. Notice that the spiral that's created, this spiral is something which shows up in nature all the time. So like the shell on a snail, for instance, is a Fibonacci sequence. The way that the flight path of an eagle diving to get its prey operates on the principle of the Fibonacci sequence. The way that plants grow uses that same sequence of events. There's lots and lots of examples of how you can use this idea or the way that it's used in nature. And then because of that, it affects the way that we understand proportions and shape and so on. So the idea of it is that by using these particular sort of, mystical shapes, these mystical proportions, that we can create something which has an incredible beauty about it, inherent within the quality. So this is the way we approach it. And you can use this idea once you understand it, for doing things like logo design, for creating proportions for illustrations or poster design or page layout or all sorts of things. All right, so I'm gonna create a new file. And once again, I'm gonna use the grid. Let me make sure my grid is back to its default settings. So I'm gonna set this to 8 subdivisions. And then I'm gonna zoom in a little bit. And I'm going to start off by drawing one square that occupies 4 of these subdivisions. I want to make sure that snap to grid is on because we want to do this very accurately. So something like that, 1 square. Next to that, because remember in the Fibonacci sequence, this is counting as 1, okay? So there's another one, because the first 2 numbers in the Fibonacci sequence are 1. Remember that you add those together to create 2. So this right here is going to be 2. And then on the side of that, we're going to have another one which represents 4. Sorry, 5. And then we're going to have this one which represents 8. And then we're going to have this one right here. And so it keeps building. And you'll notice that as I'm drawing these, I'm going around basically in a spiral. So I started here, then went around here, then around here, then here. Then this one's going to go up from here to there. Holding shift, remember, constrains it. So I know that's an exact square. And then I'm going to do another one that starts here and goes out, holding shift again. So those are the proportions of the golden section. Once you've got that, let me first of all take the fill off them so we can see the grid better. And then let's also change the color of these so we can distinguish them. I'm going to make these 100% cyan with 0 yellow, 0 black, and 0 cyan, 0 magenta. Sorry. And then I'll lock those. So Command 2 will lock it. Once I've drawn those shapes, I can then use the ellipse tool, and I'm going to draw circles which fits into each of these squares. So one will be here. I'm going to change this one now to 100% magenta. So it'll be 0 cyan, 100% N. And then I'm going to do the same thing for each of these squares. I'm going to add a circle inside it. And because I have snap to grid on, it's very easy for me to draw these shapes to fit inside those exactly. Absolutely precisely. This is one of the things I love about Illustrator is its precision. It's incredibly precise. Okay, and then we'll take that. So there's our golden circles that we need. I'm going to take those, I unlock the squares so I can move this over to this side a little bit. And then I'm going to take all of the circles. So if I select this one and then do select same stroke color, so I get all of those circles, then I can drag this out to here and hold Option to duplicate. Now at the top, I'm going to set this to horizontal align center. So this is all of our circles together that we can use for drawing now. Beautiful already, isn't it? All right, I'm going to go to Window, Artboards, and then let's add an additional artboard here on the side so we can draw a fish. The way that I'm going to draw this is by using all of these circles. So remember that the important thing to bear in mind about this is that each of these circles has a relative proportion to the other circles within it. So I forget exactly what the number is off the top of my head. I should have remembered this, but see if I can look it up real quickly. So 1.618 is the actual proportion. You can see examples of it here as the way it's drawn out. So this is based off of math, and you can see, I think it's kind of interesting also just to see the relationship of math to art. But really, it's a way for us to understand proportions, which as a designer, that's oftentimes what we're thinking about, is the relationship of one object to another object and how that creates a sense of unity or a sense of beauty or whatever. Okay, so to make the shape of the fish, I want to divide it, kind of like I was showing you earlier, something like this. So I want to have the center of the fish. But to keep the proportions consistent, I'm going to put a circle inside of here. So I'm holding Option to duplicate it. That way I still have another one that I can use later on. And then I'm going to nudge this one down until it touches. Nudge this one up until it touches there. So these two now are going to form in the middle the shape of the fish. I'm going to choose the Shape Builder tool, Option click on each side of it to get rid of that. I no longer need this circle, that was just for the size. For the tail, I'm going to take this smaller circle and put it on the end. And I want it to snap to the end of the object. Now in this particular case, the grid might actually get in the way. So I need to look at this. You can see that the point on the end of this shape is in the middle of the grid. So if I want those to touch, I need to go to Snap to Grid and take Snap to Grid off, and then drag this with Smart Guides until it touches onto that end. I'm then going to use the shape to cut away from itself. So I'm going to use this shape actually. I want to make sure that it's centered to the other one. So if I look at it in outline mode, you can see that this circle here has a little crosshair. So if I drag this center to there, I know that it's exactly in the center of the other one. Now it's not quite where I want it, but I now know that they're equal to each other, that they're level with each other. Then I'm going to move this across. And this is the shape I'm going to use to cut out the tail. And I'm going to cut it so the size of it is the same as this circle. No, actually, sorry, this circle. Let's use this one. So again, I want to line this up so that it's right on the same point right there, as accurately as I possibly can. So again, if we were to drag this shape by the point, so we take the anchor point of this shape and position it right up against that one with Smart Guides on, it should snap into position. Now I can take this one and nudge it until it touches that other one. There we go. So this one I don't need. And then with this one, I can use the Shape Builder tool and hold Option and click away from these. So we'll make sure they're selected first. Hold Option and drag through them. For the fin at the top, I'm going to again take this circle, drag it out, hold Option, get another one that's going to cut it. So I'm actually going to just use this one again. And then I'm going to select these and do minus front. So we could have done hold Option and use the Shape Builder tool to cut away from it. I just wanted to show you that we could do it with either of these tools, either the Shape Builder tool or the Pathfinder panel, as a way to cut one shape away from another shape. The other thing I can do is at the bottom here, I want to have a fin that comes sort of like this. So I'm going to use this shape for the end of it. Bring that to the front. I'm going to use this shape for the curve. Let's hold Option and duplicate that. Bring that one to the front. And then we need to make sure that these are exactly touching each other. So if I take this edge and take it up against that path so that it says path with smart guides on, I know that's in the right position there. Now if I take this ellipse or the circle and move it to here, and again, I want to make sure that this touches it exactly. So I take the path and take it to this other path so they're connected. This starts to look a bit confusing, but basically this shape in here is what I'm looking for. So if I select all three of these circles, and then I use the Shape Builder tool, through here I can unite them to make one. Hold Option here and delete this and this and this. And now we end up with that sort of teardrop shape, which is actually quite a difficult shape to draw if you were to draw that with the pen tool, for instance. And we managed to maintain this perfect circle at the bottom, which helps to kind of create a sense of unity within the design. So I'll move this down here. Let's eyedropper this color. And then I'm going to create another shape for the mouth by taking these two circles. So actually this one here, I think. Hold Option and duplicate it. Drag this one down. Hold Option and duplicate it. It's lagging really badly. I apologize. I'm going to take this anchor point and put it up against that anchor point and hold Option to duplicate it. And then with the rectangle tool, I'm going to take a rectangle that goes from this anchor point right here on the edge of the circle, goes across, and then touches on the center of this other circle. So it'll connect on that anchor point there. Then I'm going to select those three shapes, and using the Shape Builder tool, we'll unite all of that together. And then if I bring this to the front, we'll have that go across like that. We'll add an eye, bring that to the front. Shift Command right square bracket, of course. And then let's change the color of that. We'll add one more smaller one on the inside, which will be a fill. And I'm going to outline mode because that was behind. So I'll bring that one to the front. Now we've got that. And then this isn't actually in the video, but I'm going to show you one extra thing. So let's say I wanted to put some lines through this fish that kind of go along with the fin. Or we could do the same thing here on this one. I'm going to draw one line which goes from here across to here. Something like this. And I'm going to make this one a little bit thinner in terms of the stroke. Make this, say, 2 point. And I'm going to move this over a little bit further. Let's have this come out to that there. Once I'm happy with this curve, what I'm going to do is draw another one then, which goes from that same point. I have to actually start at a different point, otherwise it will connect to it. And then I'm going to have this go. I'm going to go into outline mode so I can see where that other one ends. And we're going to create a curve that goes like this. With each of those then, I'm going to select them both. And then using the blend tool, I'm going to make a blend between these two shapes. And then we could specify how many steps in between there wants to be. So I'm just going to change this to 2. And then I would end up with something that looks like that. This could go behind the fish so that we don't see that overlap. So if I select all of these objects and do send to back, now that's hidden by the edge of the fish. So that's the basis of it. So in the fish is sort of irrelevant. The idea was just to kind of give you an idea of how you could use those golden circles in, you know, logo design or symbol design or whatever it is, like keeping those beautiful proportions in place and combining them and mixing them together to create something from scratch. This is the idea of it. And then also to go over using the shape builder tool and the pathfinder tool a little bit further to construct objects. So this is a fairly complicated illustration in some ways. It'd be a difficult thing to draw by hand for sure, and to draw it as precisely as this. And so Illustrator gives us that ability to draw very precise, crisp graphics. And one of the key elements to that is the way that we can take these basic geometric shapes like circles and combine them by adding or subtracting shapes from one another. Okay, I want to do one more demonstration real quick, and then I want to go over some of the links that I have on the handout for today's class. So one of the things that you may also need to do or may need to use, one of the tools that you might need to use for this first project is the pen tool. Let's say you've done a thumbnail sketch for the project, and on Wednesday what I'll do is if people have submitted thumbnails, I'm going to go through them and take a look at them. So if you submit your thumbnails tonight, I'll take a look at the thumbnail sketches. I'm going to pick out a few and do some demonstrations about how you could work from your thumbnail sketches, work over the top of them to create things. And so you're going to be tracing stuff. You don't necessarily have to trace it, but there are times when tracing things in Illustrator becomes very useful. So this goes over the use of the template layer. And also just a few key things about how to go about using the pen tool. I have this pen tool exercise sheet, which is something which I'll upload to the class, and you can go over this if you want to. Basically, the idea of this is just to get you started. So these blue crosses, these are on a separate layer at the bottom, which is a template. But with this, I would click, 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 and click, right? This is pretty easy. I think most people, when they first use the pen tool, don't really have a hard time making straight lines. Straight lines are pretty easy. It's when we get onto doing curves that it becomes a bit more of a problem. So with a shape like this, I would click. You can see that there's an arrow next to that plus sign, the little blue plus sign at the bottom of the curve. That arrow is the direction that you're going to pull in. So I'm going to drag it in this direction. And I would basically drag it so that this handle lines up with that point right there if I wanted to create a complete curve. And same on the other side. You know? So here, if this is coming out to line up with that dot, this should be basically an exact curve. With this one right here, what I'm doing is, actually looks like I don't have this as a template. So if I draw from this point to this point, I click and drag in that direction. Then if I go up to this point right here and click and drag in the direction of that arrow, you can see that I start to form that wave. Now in this case, I'm going to hold Command. This gives me the last selection tool, which in this case was the direct selection tool. And that's what I want. I can then drag this curve back a little bit. Then at this point right here, we have these two handles or directional lines, right? This one is forming this curve right here in conjunction with this handle. So this S curve here is being created by that handle and this handle. This one right here is going to create whichever curve I do next. So because I want to go in a completely different direction, I don't want to utilize this handle or this curve at all. I'm going to click back on it to remove that handle altogether. Then I can click down here and drag to create the curve that I actually want. And then this last one, this is a template. So this is a bitmap image which I've placed into Illustrator. Remember that when you place something as a template, you go to File, Place, and you find the image of the thing that you want to trace. So let's say it was this one. At the bottom here, you can choose various options. So one of them is link, one of them is template, one of them is replace, and one of them is show options. I'm going to ignore show options for right now. Replace is grayed out because we don't have anything selected. So if we had an image selected on the Illustrator document and we then had replace checked, it would replace the image in the document with this one. But we don't have anything selected. I do want to have template on because that's the idea of this demonstration right now, is to show you how to use a template layer. And then link would be whether you want to connect the image to the original source image or whether you want to embed it. So if link is unchecked, we're embedding the image into the Illustrator file. That creates a bigger Illustrator file in terms of megabytes. But it means that I don't have to worry about that file. Let's say I go somewhere else and I take my file with me on a USB, or I email it to somebody and they download and open it. If the image is missing, if it's not in the same relative location it was before. So for instance, let's say I save both of these, both the Illustrator file and the image that I'm placing in the same folder. Let's say it was called tracing. And I have a folder called tracing. And in that folder, there's the Illustrator file that we're tracing and then also the thing that we're tracing placed. If I was to then send that folder to somebody, they wouldn't have a problem because the image that's placed into there would be in the same relative location. But in this case, I want to have link off. I just want to embed it. I don't have to worry about whether the file's there or not. In future, it's always going to be there because it's embedded directly into the Illustrator document. Okay, and I want to have template on because I'm going to trace it. So I do File, Place. And now this shows up on a special layer, which is called template. So this is the layer that's on there, which I don't need because we're not doing that, but I just want to show you how to place a template file. Also, by the way, any layer can become a template by just simply double clicking on it and choosing template. So if you place something and you forgot to place it as a template, you can always change it into a template afterwards by just double clicking on the layer and then checking the checkbox that says template. So the purpose of a template is that it allows you to see artwork when you're in outline mode. That's the main purpose of it. It does several things. So on this template layer, it's doing several things. One of them is that it's screening back the image. So this image is actually black. So if I take template off, you can see that that's actually black. But because it's on the template layer, it screens it back a little bit. It makes it easier for you to see your artwork over the top of it when you're tracing it. It also is a non-printing layer. You'll see that print is unchecked on a template layer. So that means that if I was to print this out, whatever's on the template layer would not be printed. Only the stuff that's on the rest of the layers would be printed. But the most important thing is that when you go into outline mode, you can still see this image. If this wasn't a template layer, if I change this now back so that it's not a template layer, and we go back out of outline mode and back into it, you can see that in outline mode now, all we see of that image is the outside edge of it. We just see that there is an image there, there's a rectangle there, so something's there, but we can't see it in outline mode. Whereas if it's a template, when we're in outline mode, we can see it. And the reason that that's important is that as you're drawing on the top of the template, you're going to cover up stuff that you need to draw later on. So let's say I draw down here. Let me take off Snap to Grid. It's going to get in the way in this case. So when I'm drawing this, I click and drag. I'm going to get to the point where I start to cover up parts of the shape, which I'm going to draw later on. So when we get to it, I'll point it out. And then as I'm doing this, I also wanted to show you a couple of things to bear in mind about when you're tracing in terms of how you actually operate. So first of all, you want to use as few points as possible. At least if you're trying to create smooth curving shapes or smooth shapes, you want to use as few points as possible. You only want to point wherever there's a change in direction. So here you can start to see it gets a bit confusing because you've got the fill on the inside and the outside. In outline mode, we don't have that confusion. We can see exactly where we're going. So this is why that's important when you're tracing is you want to put it on a template layer so that you can see your artwork when you're in outline mode as well as when you're in preview mode. You can see the placed artwork. And then as you're going around, I'm adding a point wherever there's a change in direction. So if you think about this shape, if you think of it as a series of hills and valleys, at the top of a hill, we have a point. At the bottom of a valley, we have a point. So basically, I come down here, it's going down, it's going down, it's going down. Now it's going to start going back up again. So let's click and drag to add a point. And if I need to readjust it, I can go back and hold Command. This gives me the last selection tool, the direct selection tool. And I can then adjust this handle as well. And the reason for doing it with a keyboard shortcut is that I haven't actually left the pen tool. You'll see that I'm still on the pen tool up here. Even if I hold Command, I'm still on the pen tool, even though my cursor appears to be the direct selection tool, which means when I let go of the Command key, I'm still actually connected to the path. I don't have to rejoin it. Whereas if I chose the direct selection tool to readjust this, then go back to the pen tool. First of all, it's an extra step because I've got to switch tools, but also I have to reconnect with that path and readjust the handles and so on before I can start again. So remember that holding the Command key will give you the last selection tool so you can readjust it. And then you can continue on your way by simply letting go of Command. And you're still connected to the path, you can continue drawing. The other thing to remember with the pen tool, which is slightly different in Photoshop, basically the pen tool in Photoshop and Illustrator are identical, but there is one slight difference, which is that when you're drawing with the pen tool in Illustrator and you get to a point where you want to change direction. So let me see if I can get to a point where we need to do that. So here I don't really, but let's say I had to change direction here. Let me do this so that I do have to change direction. So here, I'm going to need to change direction. I have an anchor point at the end here that has directional lines which come off of it. This one's going to create a curve that I don't really need. So if I click back here, it gets rid of that trailing handle, and then I can pull this in whatever direction I want. And then you can continue on your way. So it isn't up there yet, but this template will be, this tracing will be part of the week 2 exercise sheet, along with that ribbon exercise that we did earlier, okay? And I don't have a video for this yet, but I will upload a video that goes along with it, okay? Does anybody have questions about this so far? You all okay? All right, so if I go back into preview mode, I don't think I need to finish that for you to get the idea. So we just want it to go through. This is a good thing to draw in terms of practicing using the pen tool because it allows you to really focus on creating fluid curves, which is the difficult thing to do with the pen tool. I suggest that this is one of the most useful tools to learn. A lot of people kind of steer clear of it, and there are lots of other tools in Illustrator that you can use to make paths, like the pencil tool. You can modify existing shapes, and sometimes there are better ways of doing things than using the pen tool. But the pen tool, both in Illustrator and Photoshop, is a very, very accurate way for you to create a shape because you're plotting that shape very precisely. So it's a very useful tool to learn, and you can use those paths to take into a 3D program to extrude. So being able to use that pen tool is not only useful in Illustrator, it's useful in Photoshop, it's useful in stuff that you might be doing in InDesign and so on, okay? I'm also going to do a demonstration on Wednesday, which will be a tracing demonstration, where we trace over a photograph of a person. And we'll get into more detail about using the pen tool and tracing. And that is something that you can do. So there isn't actually a tracing exercise as one of the projects in this class, but you can do it as an extra credit assignment. So you can take a photograph of somebody famous or somebody that you know, and you can do a tracing of that using what I would call a Pocaccio style. Pocaccio style is a bit redundant because Plakerstil means poster style, so poster style. But that's a style of design which began in the beginning of the 20th century, and it basically simplifies it. I think the best way for you to see it is perhaps if you were to do a search for it, it's spelled like this: Plakaatstijl. Oh, sorry, no J. So Plakaatstijl, this is a good example of Plakaatstijl design from the early part of the 20th century. So the posters at that time was probably the predominant form of advertising. So in cities like New York and London and Paris and places like that, particularly places that had underground systems or public transportation systems that were highly developed for the late 1800s, they would have posters on the underground system or throughout the city, and they needed to compete for your attention. So the idea of Plakaatstijl is just simplifying everything down to basic, simple, flat forms, because they grab your attention more powerfully than if you have a more complex illustration. This Priester poster is perhaps the first Plakaatstijl poster. And he had originally designed it where it had like an ashtray and a pipe, and the matches were lighting the pipe, and there was a tablecloth on the table and stuff. And he gradually started taking things away until what was essential. Priester is, in fact, a company that makes matches. That's all that's important here. So the idea of Plakaatstijl is simplifying things down to their essence. Another example in a contemporary sense is if you look at Shepard Fairey's work. Perhaps the most famous example of his work is the Obama Hope poster, which was an important influence on the Obama campaigns, both the first one and the second one, with these Shepard Fairey posters. The way that he's creating these posters is they're screen prints, but the way that he's making the image is he's starting with a photographic image, and then he's tracing over the top of it, and he's simplifying it down to, if you look at it, there are 1, 2, 3, 4 colors. There's an off-white yellowy kind of color, there's a light blue, there's a red, and there's a dark blue. In screen printing, you generally don't print 4-color process out of dots. You generally print solid flat colors. So reducing the number of colors is important in terms of that process. But also it makes for a very powerful, bold, strong image, which is very punchy. The color is not natural at all. It's not taken from the photograph. In fact, I think the photograph was black and white initially. But the color isn't taken from that. It's a graphic symbolism. The color symbolizes America, right? The red, yellow, and white. Sorry, the red, white, and blue symbolizes America. And the yellow is sort of added there to give it a slight flavor to it, but it's basically that. So we'll take a look at that in more detail later on. Let me just make sure I've covered everything in terms of the demonstrations. So we did the ribbon. I was going to go over a little bit more Pathfinder stuff, but we're already at 1 hour and 14 minutes, and I want to try to keep these Zoom sessions at a reasonable length. So I think I'm going to leave that for right now. And we went over creating the golden section, creating fish with the golden section is what it's supposed to say. I just wanted to show you some of the links that are on the handout for today's class. So first of all, let me go to the actual PDF because these links won't work in here. So these links are on the handout for today's class. We're on week 2. So the handout for today's class is this DMAD 190 week 2 Monday 4 2020 PDF. And if I click on it, always on these handouts, there is a bunch of links. But the ones below last week, obviously, are the ones that we were looking at that were on the handouts from last week. And then the ones for this week are these. So the first one is Your Icons Are Shit. This is an article that is explaining the idea of icon design. The do's and don'ts of digital iconography. for a quick introduction, I'm a UI UX designer. Does anybody know what UI UX stands for? UI is user interface. UX is user experience. So UI is the interface where the buttons are, where the icons are in the screen, whatever it is. If you're working on a phone app or you're on a website, something like that, it's the user interface is where you navigate through a particular application. The UX is the user. So let's say you're using a website, you're using an app, you're the user. And then the experience that you have, is it frustrating? Is it a pleasure to be in that app? Or does it feel awkward and clumsy and you can't find things? That's UI UX design. So this guy's a UX designer based in Newcastle, presumably Newcastle in the United Kingdom. Icons are everywhere, literally. On the door of the toilet, at work, the packaging on your sandwiches, right across to those found in abundance on your phone. Over the X number of years I've been designing, I have been subjected to both good and damnable icons and symbolism. However, through working within design agencies, I've seen patterns emerge. So I'm not going to read through this whole thing, but you can take a look at it. There's some interesting ideas here about approaching design for icons. This one is about the Instagram icon family. I don't know whether you noticed this, but I sent an announcement over the weekend that was suggesting that you take a look at the series on Netflix called Abstract. If you haven't seen that series yet, there's now on the second series. There's a really great one. I'll post a link to this, but there's a really good one, which is focusing. Each one focuses on a particular designer. So this one focuses on a UX UI designer who does the UX UI design for Instagram. So these icons, for instance, were his development. I would highly recommend you watch some of those series because they're inspiring, they're interesting, full of information about the subject that we're all engaged in. So this talking about, here is talking about the family first. So the idea that these symbols that you're designing are all part of the same family. They should feel like they belong together, right? The use of grid structures helps with that consistency, although it's not the only thing which does. But using similar shapes, this circle is the same as this circle, identical. It makes a sense of consistency. The line thickness here is the same as the line thickness here and here and here and here. In this one, they're all solid. But this is not as unified as this one. This one has an elliptical shape for the head, whereas this is circular. Here, they've been unified, they're the same. So that's one thing to think about in your design. This is an important aspect of this project, is making sure that the symbols all feel like they belong together, that they have the same style, the same visual weight. You can set up rules for this. Here's a very subtle difference, but you see these three representations of the head: Instagram, Pinterest, and Facebook, 2005, 2010, 2015. See here, it shows how the grid is being used to define things geometrically. So you can read through this article. It's not a requirement of the course. This is purely for your information. Okay? 8 tips for creating a consistent bespoke UI icon set. Creating a harmonious icon shouldn't be difficult, plus free icons. So here you can see this is an icon set that this guy has designed. And you can see that they're based off of a grid and that they're consistent. First of all, nothing's curved. Everything is sharp, angular. And a lot of these have spaces like this space and this space and this space. But there's a real consistent feel about it. All of them are the same thickness stroke. All of them are strokes. None of them have fills. So you can read through this as well. Consistency is fundamental. Define an object icon style. Stick to one program. Use a grid. Sweat the small stuff. Make strict rules. Again, here, I'm not going to go through everything, but one thing to look at here is that he's set up a set of rules. So everything is either horizontal, vertical, or 45-degree angle. All of the stroke thickness is 2 pixels. All of the negative space is a minimum of 2 pixels. So there's no negative space in there that's smaller than that. It's smaller than the thickness of the stroke, in other words. So that you set up a set of rules like that, a set of parameters by which you create your designs, and then it helps to keep consistency. Use iconographic principles. Simple, consistent, harmonious. So all of your symbols should be that. Simple, consistent, harmonious. They're not illustrations as such. They're a different thing. We want them to be super simple. Consistency is fundamental. Okay, so that's a couple of articles for you to take a look at. This is just some examples. So this is from a website called Envato Market, where they sell clip art and so on. And here's like a bunch. I showed you this because it shows you the variety of different types of symbols. So there's some in here in color. Don't forget that your symbols should only be in black and white. I want you to focus on the negative and positive space and the relationships of shapes and so on, rather than thinking about color at this point. But here you can see there's a lot of different examples of different styles of symbols, where some of them use solids, some of them use strokes. This one, it's all solid shapes. Some of these are 3-dimensional. This, by the way, is not a very consistent set. These are very consistent. Uh, 40 visual symbols every communicator needs to know. So these are just different things which culturally we represent symbol. Remember that symbolism, to sort of define what symbolism is, a symbol is something which stands in for something else. It represents something else. It's not the thing itself. It's a drawing of the thing, or it's a photograph of the thing, or it's a word of the thing, or it's a sculpture of the thing. It's something which stands in for it. That's what a symbol is. It symbolizes it. It isn't actually it. So sometimes a symbol will be a pictogram. A pictogram is a symbol which is a drawing which represents visually what it is. But also symbols are cultural. So in certain cultures, they have different meanings. Bear that in mind in terms of symbolism, because oftentimes you want your symbols to be universal, or at least universal within a particular culture. So like within Western culture maybe. But ideally cultural across all cultures. But so I'm not going to go through all these. You can read through these if you want, but it gives you some idea of, so the peace sign, for instance, the peace sign, by the way, is an abstract symbol. This is not a pictogram because it doesn't represent the thing visually. You can't represent the word peace because peace isn't a noun, it isn't a thing, right? It's a concept, it's an idea. So it's also, you could refer to this as an ideogram or an ideograph. It's something which represents an idea. And the way that this came about actually is, at least the theory that I've read more than one theory about this, by the way. But one of them, what I read, is that it's based off of semaphore. So this symbol here, this vertical symbol, is the flags going up and down. The person doing semaphore, remember, is flags for bringing an airplane down. And then if this one's up and this one's down, that stands for the letter N. And then this, where the flags are down, so you can't really see my arms, but if I have my arms in the position of these 2 bars at the bottom, that would represent the letter D. So the original use of the peace sign was for the British Nuclear Disarmament Movement, CND. So it stood for the nuclear disarmament, actually, is what the N and the D stand for. It. That's one theory. The other theory I heard was that this was the shape of people circling an aeroplane, a bomber plane, on a British Air Force base as a protest against war. So it became a symbol for anti-war movement in general, but it was originally actually about anti-nuclear, as far as that one theory goes anyway. A lot of symbolism, it's difficult to know exactly where the symbol came from. It's lost its original meaning. But you can look through here and gives you some idea of what these different words or what these different things symbolize to us. So for instance, a rabbit can be used to represent something else. So in this case, it's saying that the rabbit is associated with concepts such as warmth, comfort, vulnerability, and fertility. Planets, they represent intellect and reason. So you can use these symbols to represent something other than the actual thing. That's usually what symbols are actually doing in essence. And then lastly, the other symbol that I have, the other link I have on today's class is this Logo Designs Trends for 2020. This is a video.
Hi, Jen McKinnon here, and I'm back with another trend roundup from Envato. Today, I'm talking about the latest logo trends. All the links to the featured items can be found in the description below. Let's jump in. From Apple and Google to Volkswagen and BMW, many brands have revitalized their logos by flattening them. It's part of the design world's detox from gradients and skeuomorphism, which we touched on.
So I'm not going to show you this whole video. You can watch it if you want to afterwards. But one of the things that she mentions there is the idea of skeuomorphism. So for a while in the sort of mid-2000s, early 2000s to mid-2000s, I would guess, there was a trend in user interface design to use what's called skeuomorphism. That's where something represents some real thing realistically. So for instance, like on the Apple icons, for instance, the icon for the compass, which represents Safari, the browser, is a compass. And in the older versions of it, the outside edge of it was made to look like it was a metal three-dimensional ring around the outside, and it had a glossy glass surface on it. The calculator looked like it had buttons which were dimensional. It had thickness to them. That's skeuomorphism, when your symbol, your icon, is representing something as if it has a real physical material quality to it. Whereas there's been a trend over the last few years to get away from that and to get back to much simpler, crisp, sharp, smooth symbols. The reason for that is that partly because of the domination of smartphones, and because we're looking at things which are very, very small, the icons are oftentimes very, very small, it's very useful for us to keep those symbols as simple as possible. And actually in design in general, the term KISS is oftentimes used by designers for a long time, has been used as an acronym which represents the kind of underlying philosophy of modernist design, which is keep it simple, stupid. You make the design simpler is oftentimes will end up being better. So how simple it is depending on the particular context and the job and so on. But particularly with this assignment, project 1, the symbols project, I really want you to think about it in a reductive process. So when you're designing your symbol, you should ask yourself repeatedly, could I simplify it further? Could I take anything away and it would still work? Would it still be understandable? Is it still legible? Would it improve its legibility? So that's the sort of process I want you to think about in terms of simplification. Do the design and then see if you can reduce it further. So start off by designing it simple anyway, but try to reduce it. This is a line which I oftentimes use when I talk about logo design. And although this is not quite the same as logo design, it's very much related to it. So with logo design, you had skeuomorphism, like that one we was talking about in the video. But you also have the same thing in icons or UX, UI design, is that icons have tended to get simpler over the last sort of 10 years. They've sort of flattened off and become simpler because they're more functional that way. So the phrase that I've oftentimes used for logos is, it should be simple and yet unique. That's a sort of like one-line catchphrase for how you design a logo. It should be simple and yet unique. So if we take the Apple logo, for instance, now let's take a look at the Apple logo over time. So the Apple logo started with this logo in 1976, which is interesting from my point of view because it's a really good example of a terrible design for a logo. So it's useful for me in my classes because they now have one of the best logos ever, and they started with one of the worst logos ever. So they're a great case study. I'm just going to bring this into Photoshop so I can make it a little bit bigger. So you can see with this first logo that its form basically has been lost already just by the fact that it's low resolution. And if I zoom out a little bit, you can see that this just ends up looking like a dirty smudge. That's the problem with that logo. It's way, way, way too complicated.
Yeah, Professor, I can't even figure out what is it.
Yeah, so I'm going to show you a better example of this so you can see it more clearly. So this is the original logo. It's first of all, it's sort of like a
So it's Newtonian.
yeah, it's like a dry point etching. It's in the style of something which is sort of late Victorian Gothic, and so from the point of view of a logo, first of all, from a practical point of view, it doesn't work very well because you can't make this. Like, let's say I wanted to have this cut out of plastic and put on the back of a laptop. It's way too complicated to do that. To do an embroidery on a T-shirt for the people who work in the Apple store, it's too complicated for that. So from a practical point of view, it's useless. But also, it doesn't really represent the company either, because the company is a high-tech company involved in the cutting edge, and yet they're having an image which represents something which is archaic. The Newtonian idea is maybe a kind of good idea, but it's still like it's too complicated. This is an illustration. It's not a logo. So this is a good example of what you're not trying to do. We're not trying to create a very detailed illustration. We're trying to create something which is simple and concise and easy to remember and easy to look at. So you can see that the logo pretty quickly changed to this one, which is basically what they have now, except it's got a rainbow in it. And then they went to these skeuomorphic ones where they look like they're made out of plastic up until the mid-2000s. And then after that, they went back to, let me go back. So after the mid-2000s, they started flattening out. And now we're at this one, flat version of the logo, completely flat version of the logo. So that's the sort of trend in logo design.
Well,
but
that's the same as in 2008, no? No, in 98. The 98 and the current one.
Yeah, it's exactly the same. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, so like I said, symbol design is not quite the same as logo design, but they're obviously very related to each other. A lot of logos involve symbols or icons, although they might just be typographic. But the same kind of thought process is involved in both. One of the differences is that with logo design, it's usually a standalone element which represents a company, whereas an icon or a symbol that we're doing in this context is part of a set of symbols. So that's one of the things you also have to focus on, is making a sense of unity, sense of consistency across all of the symbols. All 15 of the symbols that you're drawing should feel like they belong together. All right, so I think I've covered everything I want to cover. Just to recap very briefly, if you haven't already done it, don't forget that you need to submit the exercise sheet number 1. That's where there's those 6 symbols. One is the flower, one of them is the person, one of them is the cube, which you're going to recreate based off of the videos, which are in the module section for last week. Okay, so you have up until 11:59 tonight to submit that. The other thing that you should have done by now is you should have worked on thumbnail sketches for project number 1. And if you've done that, you can upload those to project 1. These are not essential that you upload them right now, but on Wednesday, what I would like to do is to pick on some of those thumbnails that you've uploaded and use them as a way to do demonstrations of how you could build out some of the logos that you're presenting. Okay, so you might end up getting a useful tip on how to create one of the logos that you've sketched out, or one of the symbols that you've sketched out, I should say. So that, just want to remind you of that. The other thing I want to remind you about is that remember that after each of the classes, from about 3 o'clock till 5 o'clock, I will have a lab time where you can come and sit in the class. Sorry, you can just pop in the class and ask me questions. So if you have some questions or you want me to go over something one-on-one with you, you can join that lab between 3 and 5, and I'll just have the lab open. I'll just have a Zoom meet. It'll be the same link that we used to get here today. And I'll be in this, I'll have the Zoom meeting open. So if you want to come in and ask me questions, or you want me to show you something again, I'm more than happy to do that. Okay. And then,
So, Professor, do we need to sign out now and then sign in again at 3, or can we just stay on?
I'm not sure whether it might kick you off, because I'm going to stop it so that I get a recording and I can upload the recording
Oh,
after
I
the
see.
class, and then I'll come back at 3. So you're most likely you'll have to rejoin.
Okay, I have a question. I need help with my Wacom so that I can do these things with my the tablet at the Wacom
Okay.
thing. Can I like schedule something
Sure.
with you?
Yeah, you can come to the lab this afternoon and I can help you.
I will do that, but you know, can I like a particular time or just whenever?
If you want to, what time do you want to come in?
I will come in at 3 whenever it's convenient for you.
All right, 3 o'clock.
Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. If not, I've covered everything I want to cover, so I'm going to take off now, and I'll be back in about 23 minutes. All right.
Okay. Thank
Okay. I'll
you.
see you guys on Wednesday,
Bye.
or maybe this afternoon if you come to the lab. Bye, guys.